And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another installment of my DC Rebirth reading guide series. Today's video 3.6, in which we're essentially just going to be covering the Dark Knight's death metal event in a fair amount of detail. That said, we are going to cover one residual thing as well, which is actually another event called Endless Winter, but this is really just Dark Knight's death metal more than anything else. As a quick intro to where this fits in the wider context, we've got to remember that I've read the whole of DC Rebirth, like the entire era of comics published by DC. That's over 3,370 single issues, and I'm releasing a guide for every single part in that. I started off by tackling certain sections of it, so I explained the bits I was excluding, I talked about the out-of-continuity comics, licensed comics, deceased, Black Label, and so on. And now we're going through the remainder, which is the core continuity, the mainstream DC universe. That tends to be what people think of when they think of the main DC universe, and that's 2,724 single issues. As you can see here, my DC Rebirth videos on my YouTube channel are split into 4 playlists. There's one mega playlist called the DC Rebirth All playlist that has every single video in it about DC Rebirth. But if that's a bit overwhelming, or if you don't like the way that's structured, there are 3 other smaller curated playlists in that. So one playlist just has the custom comics and the custom binds of the DC Rebirth era, so you don't have to go rooting around for them in the massive playlist. Another one has all the non-core continuity reading guides like DC's Licensed World and stuff like that, so again you don't have to go rooting around for them. And then the final one is just the core video, so videos like this one without any of the other ones kind of confusing you, so nothing about custom binds or anything else. That playlist is just the core continuity in sequence. Hopefully that helps. Hopefully that makes it easier to find what you want. Finally, I'm going to remind you that before you watch this video, you really should go back and watch the introductory video for the series, which is video 0.0, because it sets the scene for this whole era of comics, as well as explaining how this reading guide follows directly on from my New 52 reading guide, as well as covering some very key concepts that I'm going to refer to regularly throughout my content. Those are things like volumes with a small v, volumes with a big V, and type P and type J reader, which I know sound weird, but if you don't understand those ideas, you're not going to understand my videos, and I'm not going to explain them every single time. So with the usual introduction out of the way, today let's dive into it. We are going to be talking about death metal. Alright, and so we're back at the map, and again we're going to be establishing some valuable context before we dive into these specific issues we're talking about. As usual, we'll start off with a top level strategic map, and as you'll see here, we have Year of the Villain, which we spent the last couple of videos talking about in quite a lot of substantial depth. And then we have the Dark Knight's death metal event here, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to talk about Dark Knight's death metal, and actually we're then going to close out with Endless Winter as well, which takes us up to Future State, before we then go back to the other bits of the map we haven't yet covered for Justice League and Suicide Squad. With that in mind, let's go down to the more granular level, just so I can talk this through in a way that'll kind of set the scene for the next sort of 10-20 minutes or so. So last time we covered the whole of this grey box here, the Year of the Villain box. As you can see, we've got Justice League, and we've got all the various trades, and we've got Hell Arisen and so on. What we confirmed there is that after this volume, which is volume 5, The Justice Do More, we can go straight into volume 8, Death Metal. Last time we talked about the contents of volume 6 and volume 7, obviously volumes with a small v, and as you can see, I've actually very subtly grayed them out a little bit here to kind of indicate that these really are totally out of continuity and can be read as standalone self-contained things. So this time round, for today, we're going to be looking at the Dark Knight's death metal event here. As you can see, I put the logo there. We've got the various collections, and I'm going to talk about the collections in just a moment. And after I talk about the collections, I'm going to talk about the omnibus and the various reading details there. One last thing just while we're on this page is just to point out the bits that go into Dark Knight's death metal. If we were to go over to the metal event here, you'll see there's quite a lot of lines that go into metal. These are things like Nightwing, Flash, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, so on and so forth, because there's quite a few one-off issues that intersect with a couple of other series, including, for example, Suicide Squad, that are part of the Dark Knight's metal reading order. Now, when you go over to Dark Knight's death metal, that is not the case. None of these other characters have an essential issue that comes in as part of the death metal event. The only issues that are part of the death metal event are from the Justice League. And then we just have loads and loads of one-shots we'll talk about in a second. Aquaman's not in it. I have put Justice League Odyssey going into the Death Metal event, and we're going to talk about it in just a minute and talk about why. And Justice League Dark does not technically intersect with the event either. So literally, if we just zoom out for a moment on the map here, for the Death Metal event, the only thing that goes into it is literally Justice League. The rest of it, and there's a lot, are all random one-shot issues or the event series itself, which is, I believe, like a 7-issue main series for Death Metal. But with that bit of context out of the way, what I want to talk about right now are the actual contents of these particular 5 collections. And then what we're going to do is talk about the contents of the omnibus. Now what we can see here is my overview of the particular Dark Knight's Death Metal main collection. You'll be familiar with this from my Dark Knight's Metal read through. This is how I'm going to talk these through. So to start off with, we've got the trade paperback collection. You can see the cover of it here. Decent arc, obviously Scott Snyder, Greg Capullo, so on and so forth. It collects the 7-issue event series, Dark Knight's Death Metal. It's also available as an oversized hardcover, a deluxe edition, which is the cover here. I don't think there's a standard size hardcover. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I'm aware, there's a trade paperback version. Then there's an oversized hardcover deluxe, and that's it. There is, of course, also an absolute edition. So the absolute edition, you can see the picture of it here. And the way the absolute edition works is it also covers that 7 issues. What that means, the notable thing here, is that this is collected in a very consistent way across the different size formats for Dark Knight's Death Metal. If you recall Dark Knight's Metal, the main event book was actually collected in slightly different sequences and actual contents in the trade paperback, in the oversized hardcover, and in the absolute edition, which was annoying on every level. I can say Dark Knight's Death Metal is much more consistent. It's a 7-issue series. The trade, the oversize, and the absolute all have the same contents of 7 issues. Moving on to the next collection, we've got this one here, which is Dark Knight's Death Metal, The Darkest Night. This contains the following issues: Legends of the Dark Knight, the Death Metal Guidebook, Trinity Crisis, Speed Metal, and Multiverse's End. I'll talk about all of these in a bit more detail in just a moment when we get into the omnibus, but to start with, let's just look at this. So this is available as a trade paperback and as a oversized hardcover. Moving on, we've then got War of the Multiverses. Now this actually only collects 2 issues, but they're both oversized single issues. The first one is Death Metal Last Stories of the DC Universe, and the second one is Death Metal The Last 52, War of the Multiverses. And this is the order in which they're collected as well. And like I say, it's a full trade paperback. It's not especially slim. These are oversized issues that pack out the content. Then we have Dark Knight's Death Metal The Multiverse Who Laughs. That has the following issues in this order. We have Robin King, Rise of the New God, Infinite Hour Extreme, The Multiverse Who Laughs, which is its own one-shot, and then The Secret Origin. And finally, last but not least, we actually have a Justice League collection, which is the volume that we were just discussing. So this is volume 8, and it's Justice League Death Metal, and it just collects issues 53 to 57. Those are the trade paperback collections, and if you're interested in buying those, obviously you can do. I wouldn't recommend it. The way I would recommend watching this, or rather reading this instead, is by actually reading the omnibus. And the Dark Knight's Death Metal omnibus is by far the superior way to go through the Dark Knight's Death Metal event. You can see a picture of it here. Obviously, usual thing, name and condition, thumbnail. Please subscribe to them. It's a great channel. And I've also got a list of the contents in sequence here. These are all the issues contained in the Dark Knight's Death Metal omnibus, which you can purchase from Amazon or wherever. And this is the order in which they're in the omnibus and the order in which you should read them. What that means is now what I'll do, I'll cut away back to a specific map that I've made to talk you through what this feels like if you haven't got the omnibus and how you're going to need to read it. Well, you knew it was coming from the thumbnail alone. I have obviously made a Dark Knight's Death Metal reading map. It's sort of a reading map, but again, like I did for Dark Knight's Metal, this is very much a way to indicate how to read the single issue so it's in the best possible order if you've got the trades. So, with no further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to show you the trades here on the side first, and just to make it nice and simple, I've color coded them. You've got the main Death Metal trade collection here, green box, Justice League, red box, Multiverse Who Laughs, purple box, Darkest Night, a kind of a baby blue box, and War of the Multiverses in this yellow box. Right, so close your eyes, imagine you're sitting on the couch, you've got your 5 trade paperbacks sitting next to you, you want to read the Death Metal event in order, you don't have the omnibus. How do you read it? Right, to start off with, you reach over and you grab the main Death Metal collection and you read the first issue. Great, you read Death Metal issue 1. You then read Death Metal issue 2. You then stop, you put it down, and you pick up the next trade paperback. And in this case, as you can see here, we're looking at Legends of the Dark Knight, which is a compilation of short stories, actually. And as you can see, Legends of the Dark Knight is this one here, the Darkest Night trade paperback. After reading Legends of the Dark Knight, which is a compilation, you then go back to the main one and you pick up Death Metal 3 and you read that. You then put it down again and you pick up the trade paperback you were just looking at and you read Death Metal Guidebook, which is again a compilation of short stories, and you then read Trinity Crisis. Now, Trinity Crisis, if you're reading it in single issues, does say it continues in Death Metal issue 4, but don't worry about that. Relax. What you then need to do is pick up your Justice League trade paperback and read Justice League issue 53. You then need to put that down and pick up the last trade paperback again, blue outline, and you then need to read the Speed Metal one-shot. Now, this is potentially a sequel to the event Flash Forward, but we'll get into that in a moment. I'll talk about that at the end of the video. And then after reading that, the next issue in that trade is Multiverse's End. Great. Put that trade down, pick up the main collection again, and then you read Dark Knight's Death Metal issue 4. Stop, put it down, pick up your Justice League trade. You're reading Justice League issue 54. Now, the interesting thing about Justice League issue 54 is this actually references the end of Justice League Odyssey. So Justice League Odyssey issue 25 has already happened at this point, and then the finale of that leads into this issue here. That's why on the larger map there was a solid line from Justice League Odyssey leading into this, because this is where the protagonists from Justice League Odyssey eventually end up. And we'll cover that in video 3.9 in this series when we're talking about Justice League Odyssey in more detail. Put down the Justice League book, pick up the next trade, purple outline obviously, and read the Robin King one-shot. If you're reading this as single issues, which you might be, again, this says to be continued in Dark Knight's Death Metal 5. Don't worry about that. Put it down anyway. Pick up the next one, which is Justice League. Again, you're back to your Justice League trade paperback, issue 55. Great. Read that one issue, put it down, go back to the previous trade, pick it up and read Rise of the New God. This is the cover here. Put it down, back to Justice League again, and then you're going to be reading issue 56. Put that down, and then you're picking up Infinite Hour Extreme, which is in the same trade as the Robin King and Rise of the New God and so on. Is actually an annoying and pretty shit issue. It's all Lobo focused. If you're a Lobo fan, you'll enjoy it, but if not, you won't. And again, keep in mind, the purple border is this, the Multiverse Who Laughs. After reading the Extreme one-shot, you then get into our next main issue, which is Death Metal issue 5. Fantastic. After that, put that down and again, pick up Justice League, and we've got Justice League issue 57. Now, this references Dark Knight's Death Metal Infinite Hour Extreme, the Lobo one-shot. And at the end, it also reunites Lex with the Legion of Doom, which essentially kind of explains where they turn up with in death metal. Long story short, if that's confusing, don't worry about it. The point is these two things happen kind of at the same time, but this is the way they're collected in the omnibus, and I would recommend reading them in this order because, I mean, you can't read two issues simultaneously. So I would recommend reading Death Metal 5, and then after Death Metal 5, reading Justice League 57. Next, again, changing trade paperback. We've got the purple outline here. What you need to read is Multiverse You Laughs, and then also Secret Origin, which does end saying to be continued in Dark Knight's Death Metal 7. Obviously, that is not the case. Well, it is the case, but you don't have to read that next. What you should read next is here, and it's Last Stories of the DC Universe. Again, this is a different trade paperback. That's why it's in yellow. This is the War of the Multiverse trade paperback. This one ends saying to be continued in Dark Knight's Death Metal 6. So, again, don't worry about that because that actually is the next issue we're looking at. We're looking at this issue here, Dark Knight's Death Metal 6. After that, put that back down, reach over, pick up the War of the Multiverses trade and read the second half of it, which is the last 52 War of the Multiverses. After you've read that, finally, you can reach back over and pick up your Death Metal collection and you can read the final and 7th issue. As ever, these maps are going to be on my website if you want to look at them. As ever, I'm going to continue sort of tweaking them and improving them and doing various bits with them. But hopefully you can see here exactly how this is kind of intended to be. As I say, when you're thinking about how to read death metal, if you have the single issues, this is the order in which to arrange them in. If you have the omnibus, this is the order in which they are arranged. And if you have the trades, which is how I originally did it, then there's a lot of putting the one down, picking up the next one, putting one down, picking up the next one. But this is the sequence in which to read them, and these are the trades, and they're all kind of color-coded and color-matched. All right, hopefully that was helpful. Now, there are two things or two tips that I just want to point out before we close out talking about Dark Knight's Death Metal, and that is this. Firstly, Dark Knight's Death Metal 7 leads directly into two sequential one-shots. Those are Generations Shattered, followed by Generations Forged. Now, a lot of reading orders online say that these are the final two issues that you need to read as part of Death Metal, and that they kind of close out the Rebirth era, or rather all the comics and that whole era up to, but not including Future State. I don't agree. Insanely, both of these stories star the character Dominus from the pre-New 52, the 1990s in fact, and I'm only familiar with the character Dominus from having done the Superman read-through of every Superman issue from 1991 to 2011. The point about these two issues is they were meant to set up the 5G reboot and the linear verse. That was Dan Didio's final vision. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, you need to watch my video about the three writers and the different creative conflicts during the DC Rebirth era. But long story short, they're part of a plan that totally failed to materialize, and as such they can be ignored entirely. I'm mentioning them here because they were published during the Rebirth era, but they're not part of any Rebirth reading guide, reading map. They're not part of any trade collections. I wouldn't recommend reading them. They don't link into anything, and they're not in the Death Metal Omnibus. Do not get fooled into thinking these are important. They are not. My second tip is this. You don't need to read either Watchmen or Doomsday Clock or anything like that to understand this vision, or rather this event. By the point that we get to Dark Knight's Death Metal, the Snyder vision for the DC Universe has now entirely and successfully supplanted Jeff Johns' Doomsday Clock DC Rebirth vision. Now, that said, some residual Tom King elements are potentially relevant to read here. Specifically, the events of Heroes in Crisis lead into something called Flash Forward, and the events of Flash Forward is some useful context here, as it goes quite a long way to explain why the Flash we see in this event, especially in the Speed Metal one-shot, is quite different to the depiction of the Flash that we saw during the Year of the Villain issues. However, if you're a Type J reader, I would just tell you just to chill out, relax, and just leave that. You'll work that out when we get to that bit. But right now, you don't need to read all that. It's a thread that involves going back really far. It's really complicated. It's really confusing. Don't worry about it. You'll get to this event and you'll just be like, oh, Flash is just really weird here. Yeah, that's fine. That's all you need to know. If you're a Type P reader, then best of luck to you, because what you will need to do is pull that thread back of Flash Forward and Heroes in Crisis, going all the way back to try to unravel and find a good starting point there. And frankly, there isn't one. So those are my two major tips for Dark Knight's Death Metal. Let's jump back to the map. And here we are back at the strategic level map. Now, as I said, we've been talking about Dark Knight's Death Metal in a fair bit of detail. We've done that. We're finished with that event now. And that literally only leaves one Justice League issue for the main Justice League series by Scott Snyder and so on. That takes us up until the line-wide universe sort of demarcation of Future State. And as I said, Future State is a line-wide event that affects absolutely everything for a couple of months, and is where I'm drawing the line at the end of Rebirth. All the issues after Future State are branded as being Infinite Frontier, which is the era after Future State, on after DC Rebirth. And so Justice League issue 59 is branded Infinite Frontier. But what that means is Justice League issue 58 is somewhere between Dark Knight's Death Metal, which includes Justice League issue 57, and somewhere between that and Future State, you have this one Justice League issue, Justice League 58. So that should be straightforward, but unfortunately, as is always the way with Rebirth, is more complicated than that. That final Justice League issue, and in fact, I'm just going to scroll down here. Here we are. That final Justice League issue, keeping in mind this contains up to 57, that Justice League issue 58 is contained here in what's called Justice League Volume 9, Endless Winter. And that one issue, that one Justice League issue, is the centerpiece for a relatively large event that intersects with 3 other series and also generates several one-shots. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through exactly what that one-shot, which is surprisingly, as you can see here, surprisingly long and all-encompassing. I'm going to talk you through what that long one-shot contains next. So the Endless Winter event was written by Andy Lanning and Ron Mars. No Scott Snyder here. It features a new villain, again, called the Frost King, who's trying to cause an eternal global winter, whilst the Justice League and their allies attempt to stop him. This comes straight off the back of Death Metal, by the way. The series also shows the Frost King's previous attempt to conquer the world back in the 10th century, which was stopped by a group of heroes from that time. So it has like 2 narratives going on. And so as you can see here, we've got the final Justice League trade paperback, which is a Justice League collection, Justice League Volume 9, but it's simultaneously the event book for this event, which is Justice League Volume 9, Endless Winter, volume with a small v, obviously. But it's the Endless Winter event book. It's also available, as well as being a trade paperback, is available as a standard size hardcover. Now you can see the contents here. We've got Justice League Endless Winter 1, which is a one-shot. It's worth noting this references the destruction of a key location from Man of Steel issue 4 over in the Superman family. And it also references a major event to do with Superman's identity, also in the Brian Michael Bendis Superman arcs over there, which we're going to be covering as section 8 of this reading guide. Keep in mind we're only in section 3. Next is issue Flash 767, which is the last Flash issue of the DC Rebirth era. We'll talk about that more in a second. We then have a Superman one-shot, which is Endless Winter Special. You will notice I haven't drawn a line from Superman going into the box on my map, and I'll explain to that in just a second. We then have Aquaman 66, which references the dissolution of the Atlantean monarchy, which is happening during the Aquaman series. And Aquaman 66 is also the final issue of Aquaman before Future State and subsequent Infinite Frontier branding. We then have one Justice League issue, Justice League 58, which is the reason why this is a Justice League trade paperback. We then have a Teen Titans special, and again, I'm not connecting this in as being a Teen Titans linked event for a reason you'll see in a moment. We then have the final issue of Justice League Dark, which is Justice League Dark 29. It's the final issue for this era, although we will talk more about Justice League Dark in video 3.8. And we then have a Black Adam Endless Winter special. And keep in mind, there is no Black Adam series. There is no Black Adam ongoing or anything like that. So this is one of the reasons why I didn't want to include stuff like Superman and Teen Titans and things like that to say, oh, hey, this relates to an existing series. Because they don't. These are literal just one-shot issues. I don't know why they didn't just call them Endless Winter 1, 2, 3, 4 and so on. But they didn't. And then we have the second Justice League Endless Winter issue, which is the final one and the capstone for that. So whilst the Endless Winter special are simply one-off events, specifically for the event, you have got some final future state issues for 4 series. And what I'll do, let's jump back to the map and let's discuss those. So we're back at the map again. This is the Endless Winter box, which, like I say, is surprisingly an annoyingly tall box, given it's actually just one relatively small event. But keeping in mind, we've got this line here, which is from Flash. Now, Flash was an essential series, rather not an essential series, but it had an essential tie-in that went into death metal. It then had the usual token tie-in to Year of a Villain, but it then has an essential tie-in in Endless Winter. We obviously have the Justice League issue tie-in, Justice League 58, which is the reason why this volume exists. Aquaman, again, Aquaman is an essential part of Sync Atlantis, and Sync Atlantis is an essential prequel to Drowned Earth, which is why we're talking about it. Aquaman has his usual token bullshit getting into Year of the Villain, and then there's some other random unrelated stuff that doesn't intersect with the death metal event. And then we do have an essential Aquaman issue, which is Aquaman 66, as just mentioned, that is part of this Endless Winter event. And then finally over here, we've got the Justice League Dark volumes, and they're all like essential because we're in the Justice League map. So these are all going to be things that you should read if you're interested in the Justice League family. And then they don't intersect with the death metal event, but there is one final bit that does intersect with Endless Winter. We'll talk about this final straggler bit when we get to that video in 3.8. So hopefully that makes sense why there's these 4 lines going into the Endless Winter event, but most of them are one-shot specials, and things like the Black Adam special, there is no Black Adam series. So I didn't want to have some kind of random thing saying Superman's irrelevant until you get the Superman special, because that Superman Endless Winter special is just an Endless Winter event issue. It's nothing to do really with Superman or Teen Titans or all the other various ones that we talked about. Overall, Endless Winter is a pretty mediocre story. It's a standard JLA stuff. It reminds me of, I don't know, things like the Obsidian Age. And there have been so many kind of like stories about, oh, Atlantis from ages gone past has an evil king or an evil magical thing and is really important, and something happens and it tried to take over the world and everyone forgot, and now it's doing it again. I have forgotten how many times that basic story has happened in DC. It's not bad, it's just kind of, I've seen it all before. And that is our last Justice League issue. So, wow, it's taken us 6 videos to get through this. But the reason is, as we can see if we scroll up, the number of events that we've had to talk through and do in a fair amount of detail in order to do this justice has been pretty profound. So, on that note, quick recap, just to remind you at a strategic level, what we've covered is Justice League, this event here, Justice League, and all of Justice League of America, Dark Knight's Metal in detail, no Justice League, more Justice League there, sorry, no Justice, then more Justice League there, Drowned Earth, all of the Year of the Villain, over to Dark Knight's Death Metal, and finally ending in Endless Winter. What an absolute slog, and that is literally hundreds and hundreds of issues. Keep in mind, Year of the Villain alone was over 140 issues. So diving down into trade paperbacks, what does that mean we have covered? We have covered everything from here, Justice League Volume 1, The Extinction Machines, and we've covered this box, all of these, the entirety of the Metal event, including Tales from the Dark Multiverse. We continued on with Justice League, we went into No Justice, then we started with the Snyder Justice League there, we continued the whole Snyder Justice League, we did the whole of the Year of the Villain, which was a massive slog. We then covered some more Justice League things here that are kind of out of continuity, or rather out of sort of key sequencing, probably a better way to put it. And then we cover the whole death metal event today, which has taken some time. And then we continued on to the very last issue and the final event, which is Endless Winter. And that, ladies, gentlemen, and others, takes us up to the future state event for Justice League. If you read everything we've talked about from video 3.1 up till today, you have read the entirety of the main single Justice League series and all the events it crosses over with. Wow. Quite a slog. Well, in the next video in this series, 3.7, we are going to be looking at Suicide Squad, and we're going to run through all the Suicide Squad stuff, and then we're going to follow that up by talking about Justice League Dark in the video after that, and then finishing out with Justice League Odyssey. And then we will have covered the entirety of the Justice League family. But thanks for sticking around, and remember, the map is available on my website.
All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at @IamThomasJudge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.